more shock and dauntingness was more of the feeling I felt. But it was, the thing is, it's, I think I was on such a high anyway. And so.
In the hushed halls of Buckingham Palace, a storm was brewing, one that would shake the monarchy to its core. It wasn't a scandal splashed across the tabloids, but a private moment that left royal staff stunned into silence. When Camilla allegedly uttered a cruel remark about Princess Diana, she never expected the wrath it would unleash. Prince William, normally calm, measured, and restrained, rose to his mother's defense with a fury that left everyone in shock. What followed was a confrontation so intense, so unforgettable, it threatened to fracture the royal family itself. This is that story. The shocking confrontation. The morning had begun like any other within the walls of Clarence House. The staff moved about their duties with quiet precision, silver trays polished until they gleamed, and the scent of freshly brewed tea drifting faintly through the corridors. It was the kind of calm that often cloaked the royal household, a silence broken only by the muffled footsteps of attendants or the rustle of documents being carried from one office to another. No one could have imagined that by midday, those same halls would be vibrating with tension, forever marked by an altercation whispered about long after the doors had closed. Camilla entered the room first, her presence commanding but casual, as though she had grown used to holding court among staff who bowed their heads at her arrival. She carried herself with the air of someone who had fought hard for her position and now savored it with quiet confidence. Yet beneath her composed exterior lay a tongue that could cut as sharply as any blade. It was during an ordinary exchange, one that began with a simple comment about public perception, that her words turned venomous. With the faintest curl of her lips, she let slip a remark about Diana, one that mocked her memory, diminishing the beloved princess in front of staff, who still regarded her as a saintly figure. The air thickened instantly. Conversations halted. A footman froze mid-step, his tray trembling in his hands. A secretary looked up in horror, her pen pausing against the page as if the ink itself refused to flow after such a statement. Camilla's words did not echo loudly through the room, but they landed with the force of thunder, reverberating against the loyalty and love that Diana's memory commanded within the palace. Unbeknownst to her, Prince William had been standing just beyond the doorway. He had come quietly, intending to speak with one of his aides, when the words about his mother struck his ears like shards of glass. For a brief second he did not move, his face drained of color, his jaw locked, and every muscle in his body tensed as though the insult had ignited something ancient and unyielding within him. When he stepped into the room, silence swallowed the air whole. Staff turned their eyes toward him, sensing a storm they dared not interrupt. His gaze was fixed, sharp, burning not with the polished calm of a royal diplomat, but with the raw fury of a son defending his mother's honor. He looked directly at Camilla, and for the first time in years, her composure faltered. The faint smirk that had danced across her lips vanished as she realized her words had found the one audience she had not anticipated. William's voice, low but thunderous in its conviction, shattered the stillness. What he said in that moment was not rehearsed or tempered by duty. It was the unfiltered response of a man unwilling to allow his mother's memory to be desecrated within the palace walls. And as those words spilled forth, the confrontation became inevitable. It was no longer just a remark made in passing. It was the spark that would ignite one of the most unforgettable clashes in modern royal history. Camilla's cruel remark. The silence that followed William's entrance was suffocating, as though the very air in the room refused to move. Every pair of eyes darted nervously between the prince and the woman who had dared to speak ill of Diana. The weight of his stare was unbearable, and for a fleeting moment Camilla seemed to shrink in the grand room that she so often dominated. She adjusted her posture, lifted her chin, and tried to recover her composure, but there was no disguising the unease that flickered across her face. William had heard everything, and there was no escape from what had been said. Camilla's remark had not been whispered. It had been delivered with the deliberate sharpness of someone who knew her audience and did not expect opposition. With a mocking tone, she had described Diana as nothing more than a troubled woman who had brought scandal upon herself, a princess whose struggles overshadowed her supposed accomplishments. She had questioned why the staff still clung to a woman who, in her view, had been more of a burden than a blessing to the royal household. The words were laced with disdain, an attempt to erase Diana's luminous legacy with a single cruel brushstroke. Hearing such words was like witnessing a sacred portrait being defaced before their very eyes. Many of them had worked under Diana, had seen her warmth, had been touched by her humanity in ways the public would never know. To hear her reduced so coldly, dismissed as though her life and struggles meant nothing, left them stunned. A maid lowered her eyes, fighting back tears, while a butler shifted uncomfortably, wishing he could vanish into the walls. In that moment, it was not simply Camilla speaking, it was a challenge to the collective memory of a woman the world still mourned. William's chest rose and fell with quiet fury. He had been taught all his life to control his emotions, to conceal anger beneath layers of regal discipline. But this was different. This was his mother, the woman who had kissed him goodnight when the cameras were gone, who had shielded him from the coldness of palace politics, who had given him the kind of affection that could never be replaced. To hear her insulted in her absence was to tear open a wound that had never truly healed. Camilla tried to explain herself, her voice stumbling as she claimed she had only been speaking of perception, of how history often exaggerated Diana's virtues. But the words rang hollow. The staff did not believe her, and William certainly did not. The insult had already landed, and no amount of backtracking could erase the venom with which it had been delivered. The tension grew unbearable. William took a step closer, his eyes unwavering. He did not raise his voice, but the gravity of his words cut deeper than any shout could have. He reminded Camilla in front of everyone that Diana's memory was not only sacred to him, but to millions across the world. He warned her that no insult, no cruel remark would ever be tolerated in his presence again. His voice carried the weight of a future king, but more than that, it carried the unshakable conviction of a son whose love for his mother could not be silenced. The staff stood frozen, witnessing history unfold in real time. They would later whisper about this moment in hushed tones, recounting every detail of the insult and the fury it unleashed. For them, the day Camilla mocked Diana and William confronted her was not just another palace drama. It was a reckoning, one that revealed fault lines within the royal family that had long been hidden beneath polished ceremonies and careful smiles. The confrontation was only beginning. What Camilla had said could not be unsaid, and William's fury had only just found its voice. What followed would test not only their relationship, but the very fabric of royal unity. The air was electric, the stage set for a clash that would leave scars on both sides. William's protective instincts ignite. The air was still trembling with the weight of Camilla's cruel words when William stepped forward, his expression carved from stone. The staff who lingered in the corners of the room held their breath, aware they were about to witness a moment that would be whispered through palace halls for years. His voice had already carried a warning, but now his entire presence radiated something deeper, something fierce and unyielding. It was no longer just about an insult. It was about a son protecting the only person who had ever truly understood him in a world of cold formality and duty. Camilla's eyes flickered nervously as William drew closer. She had known the young prince since childhood, had watched him grow into a man, but she had underestimated the steel that ran through his veins. He was his mother's son. He carried her fire, her stubbornness, and above all her refusal to be silenced when injustice was laid before her. Every inch of him now bore the posture of a defender, not of a title, but of a memory so precious it could not be tarnished by careless cruelty. "Do not speak her name in that way again," William said, his voice low yet commanding, every syllable heavy with restrained fury. His words reverberated through the silence, making even the walls feel closer, as though the room itself leaned in to listen. The staff shifted, unable to look away. They were trained to fade into the background, to serve without being seen, yet now they found themselves unwilling witnesses to a clash between history and legacy, between loyalty and betrayal. Camilla attempted to straighten her shoulders, to summon the authority she had so carefully cultivated as the wife of the future king. Yet her confidence faltered in the face of William's conviction. She tried to respond, insisting that her comments were misunderstood, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her unease. William did not flinch. He saw through the excuses, through the attempted softening of words that had been sharp and deliberate only moments before. In his mind, flashes of Diana came alive, her laughter, bright and unrestrained, her kindness to strangers who would never forget her touch, her endless sacrifices to shield her sons. From the suffocating glare of royal life, he remembered the day of her funeral, the sound of his own footsteps echoing through the streets of London as he walked behind her coffin, the grief that felt as though it would split him in two. That pain, that love, burned in him now, fueling every word. "You forget," he continued, his voice steadier now, carrying the authority of someone who knew he would one day rule, "that she gave more to this family and to this nation than you ever could. You forget that she is loved not because of the crown, but because of her heart. That love will outlast all of us, and I will never allow anyone, not even you, to diminish it." Camilla's lips parted as if to reply, but no words came. The room had grown colder, the atmosphere brittle and unrelenting. Staff members averted their eyes, yet their ears were fixed on every syllable, knowing they were witnessing a line being drawn in history. This was not simply a prince defending his mother's legacy. It was a declaration that Diana's presence still lingered, that her memory would always stand guard through her son. William's protective instincts had ignited fully, and there was no mistaking the storm in his eyes. Camilla, for perhaps the first time in years, found herself outmatched, her authority crumbling beneath the force of a son's devotion. The confrontation was no longer just a clash of words. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would leave neither untouched. The moment of no return. The weight of William's words still hung heavy in the air, their echoes circling the room like an unrelenting storm. Camilla's attempt to regain her composure faltered as silence pressed down upon her. Every staff member present remained rigid, as though even the smallest movement might shatter the fragile stillness and trigger another eruption. William stood unmoved, his chest rising steadily, his expression a mixture of anguish and unyielding fury. It was no longer a conversation, it was a reckoning. Camilla's instinct was to push back, to remind William of her place beside his father, the man who would one day be king. But the certainty that usually bolstered her failed her now. William's eyes bore into hers with an intensity she could not meet. For the first time since she had entered the royal household as Charles's companion, she found herself stripped of the protection her status afforded. The authority she leaned on so easily crumbled in the presence of a son's devotion to the mother she had replaced. William's voice returned, sharper than before, no longer a warning but a command forged from years of pent-up emotion. He told her plainly that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. His words were not raised in anger, but the steadiness of his tone was far more damning than any outburst could have been. The staff, listening in stunned silence, felt the air grow heavier with every syllable. What they were witnessing was not just a private quarrel. It was a fracture in the royal family exposed in the most unguarded moment imaginable. Camilla tried again to excuse herself, her voice tight, claiming that she had spoken out of context, that her remark was nothing more than an observation about public perception. But William would not allow her escape. He stepped forward, his presence filling the room, his words cutting through her defense. He told her that his mother's legacy was not up for debate, not to be diminished or mocked, especially not within these walls where Diana's shadow still lingered. His voice did not tremble. It carried the authority of a man who knew his mother's memory was larger than the crown itself. Then came the moment that left every witness stunned into disbelief. William, his patience exhausted, told Camilla to leave. His words were not wrapped in politeness or softened by royal diplomacy. They were blunt, final, and laced with the fire of a son who would no longer allow his mother's name to be tarnished. "Leave this room," he ordered, his voice reverberating with a force that seemed to shake the walls. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The idea of Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall, being dismissed by William in front of staff was unthinkable, yet here it was unfolding before their eyes. Camilla's face stiffened, her lips tightening as the humiliation sank in. The woman who had endured years of scandal and criticism from the public, who had carefully rebuilt her reputation brick by brick, now found herself undone in a single instant. To walk away would be to admit defeat, to accept that William had stripped her of authority in front of the very people she had tried to command. Yet she could not ignore the fire in his eyes, nor the fact that every servant in the room now stood frozen, watching, waiting, silently siding with Diana's son. She lingered for a moment, her hands tightening around the edge of the table, as if holding on would anchor her against the tide of humiliation. But William's expression never softened. The demand remained unyielding, and the silence of the staff was deafening. At last, with a curt nod, Camilla turned and walked toward the door. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor, the sound echoing like a retreat. No one spoke. No one moved until the door closed behind her. William stood motionless for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the space she had just vacated. His body trembled slightly with the force of what had transpired, yet he did not falter. The staff, still silent, felt they had witnessed something sacred, a son defending his mother with a courage that defied the boundaries of royal protocol. It was the moment of no return, a moment that would linger in whispers and shadows, altering the dynamics within the palace forever. Royal staff in shock. The door had barely clicked shut behind Camilla before the room exhaled a breath it had been holding for far too long. The silence that followed her departure was not one of peace, but of disbelief, a stunned stillness that gripped every soul present. The staff, trained to maintain composure under even the most extraordinary circumstances, found themselves caught in the aftermath of something unprecedented. Their eyes darted toward William, who stood still as stone, his face a mask of control, though the storm in his heart was evident to anyone who dared to look closely. For a few moments, no one moved. The clink of cutlery, the shuffle of papers, the ordinary rhythm of palace life had been shattered, leaving behind only the sound of William's steady breathing. A footman at the edge of the room tightened his grip on a tray until his knuckles whitened, while a secretary lowered her gaze, pretending to write though her pen had not touched the paper in minutes. Every detail of what had unfolded was already etched into their memories, ready to be whispered behind closed doors when the corridors emptied. It was one thing to serve royalty, to witness arguments or frustrations tucked safely behind the veil of gilded walls. It was another to see the future king openly confront the woman who had fought for decades to secure her place by Charles's side. Some would later say they had never seen William more like his mother than in that moment. The fire in his eyes, the unshakable defiance, the unwillingness to allow cruelty to stand unchecked. It was Diana's spirit, alive again, pulsing through her son in a way that none of them could ignore. As William finally turned, his eyes swept over the staff who stood frozen in place. For a fleeting second, he seemed almost vulnerable, as though the weight of what he had done was beginning to sink in, yet he gave no apology, no explanation. He simply nodded once, a silent command that the moment was over, before striding out of the room. His departure was quiet, but the force of his presence lingered long after his footsteps faded down the corridor. The instant he was gone, the whispers began. They were hushed, urgent, and tinged with awe. Servants who had remained loyal to Diana felt a thrill of vindication, their hearts swelling with unspoken gratitude that her son had defended her so fiercely. Others exchanged nervous glances, aware of the consequences this confrontation could ignite. The palace was a place where every action carried weight, where rumors had a way of seeping into the press, and this moment was too explosive to remain hidden for long. By evening, the encounter had already become legend within the household. Stories spread like fire through kitchens, offices, and quiet servants' quarters. Each retelling grew sharper, more dramatic, until it seemed the entire palace buzzed with the same astonishment. William had stood against Camilla, and he had forced her to leave. The very thought sent ripples of shock and excitement through the staff, for they knew they had witnessed more than a simple quarrel. They had seen history twist in a way that no one could have predicted, a fracture between the past and the present, between Diana's memory and Camilla's reign. In their hearts, many of them knew one truth above all others. The ghost of Diana had never truly left these walls, and through her son, her presence had once again silenced the room. The ghost of Diana's legacy. Long after the confrontation, the palace seemed to settle into a heavy quiet, though the echoes of what had transpired still clung to its walls. The staff went about their duties with their usual precision, yet their minds drifted back to the scene they had witnessed, their hands moving by habit while their thoughts lingered on William's fury and Camilla's retreat. It was impossible to shake the feeling that Diana herself had walked the corridors that day, her unseen presence guiding her son to rise in her defense. The moment had passed, but the essence of the late princess seemed alive again, stirring memories that had never truly faded. Diana's name was more than a memory within those walls. For many of the staff who had served her, it was an unspoken vow, a reminder of the humanity she brought into a world of ceremony and tradition. They remembered her warmth, the way she stopped to ask after their families, the way she spoke not as a royal above them, but as a woman who cared. Her compassion had carved itself into the hearts of those who worked closest to her, and even now, years after her passing, her presence remained stronger than that of most who still lived under the crown. William's confrontation had brought those memories flooding back. In the staff's eyes, he had become the embodiment of his mother's spirit, carrying her fire into a moment that demanded it. He had reminded them that Diana's legacy could not be erased by cruel remarks or polished titles. It was written in the hearts of millions across the world and carried daily in the way her sons lived their lives. For the palace staff, the day had proven what they had always believed in silence. Diana's influence was eternal. In the public eye, Diana was the people's princess, the woman who broke through the stiffness of royal duty with a smile that seemed to light the darkest rooms. In private, within the walls of the palace, she was a figure of love and defiance, a woman who refused to bend to the coldness of protocol. That defiance had not died with her. It lived now in William, in the way he stood before Camilla and refused to allow his mother's name to be tarnished. His actions were not just those of a son defending a parent. They were the living proof that Diana's shadow still stretched across the monarchy, unyielding and ever-present. As the staff whispered in corners and replayed the confrontation in their minds, they realized that this was not a fleeting clash. It was a reminder that no matter how the royal family tried to move forward, Diana's memory remained an anchor and a force. She was gone, yet she remained the measure by which others were judged, her ghost haunting the palace in ways that could not be denied. Through William's rage and Camilla's humiliation, her presence had spoken louder than any voice, reminding them all that some legacies never fade. Camilla's humiliation. The echo of her heels on the polished floor haunted Camilla long after she had left the room. Each step away from William had felt like a retreat, not just from his presence, but from the authority she had fought so long to establish. Behind her, she knew the staff would already be whispering, their loyalty leaning toward Diana's son, their eyes recording every detail of her humiliation. It was an image she could not shake, the future king's unwavering stare, the staff's silence, and her own forced departure, a scene that stripped her of dignity in the one place where she had always craved respect. When she finally reached the privacy of her chambers, the mask she wore for the world cracked. Alone, Camilla pressed her hands against the edge of a desk, steadying herself against the tide of emotion rising within her. She had endured decades of public scorn, had been labeled a mistress, a homewrecker, a villain in Diana's story. She had thought herself hardened against judgment, armored by survival, and by the eventual acceptance granted her as Charles's wife. Yet this moment was different. This was not the disdain of strangers beyond palace gates. This was the rejection of the son whose acceptance she had hoped for, the boy she had once seen playing in the gardens, now grown into a man who could shatter her composure with a single command. The sting of William's words replayed in her mind, each one sharper than the last. He had not shouted, had not raised his hand or his voice, yet the calm certainty with which he dismissed her was more cutting than any rage could have been. His declaration had not only silenced her but reminded her of a truth she could never outrun. Diana's shadow would forever loom larger than her own presence. No matter how many years she spent by Charles's side, no matter how dutifully she carried out her role, she would never erase the memory of the woman who had captured the hearts of a nation. Camilla's humiliation deepened as she considered how quickly the staff had aligned themselves with William. Their eyes had spoken what their lips could not. They had not pitied her. They had not rushed to ease her discomfort. Instead, they had stood in quiet solidarity with Diana's son, the rightful heir, the embodiment of the mother they still revered. In that silence, Camilla had seen her own isolation, the stark reminder that she would always be tolerated, never loved, within the walls that still belonged to Diana in spirit. She paced the room, her thoughts colliding with memories of battles past. She remembered the years when her very name was whispered with disdain in the press, when photographers hounded her, when the world seemed united against her. She had weathered that storm, survived long enough to step into the role of Duchess, and even begun to carve out a measure of public acceptance. Yet all it had taken was one moment with William to unravel so much of what she believed she had secured. The humiliation was not just in the command to leave, it was in the knowledge that William's fury had been righteous, born not from malice, but from love. It was in the way his words had struck a chord with every soul in the room, exposing her own remark for what it truly was: cruel, unnecessary, and unforgivable in the eyes of those who still carried Diana in their hearts. That truth seared deeper than William's dismissal. By nightfall, Camilla's humiliation had transformed into something heavier, a weight pressing on her chest as she realized the implications. This was not a fleeting quarrel that would be forgotten by morning. This was a rupture, a scar that would linger in the eyes of the staff and in the memory of the son who would one day be king. For all her resilience, Camilla could not escape the reality that she had been forced out, not by Charles, not by the public, but by the very embodiment of Diana's enduring legacy. Alone in her chambers, she whispered to herself that she would endure, as she always had. Yet the tremor in her voice betrayed her. The humiliation was complete, and in her heart she knew that William's defiance had marked a turning point. She could rebuild her composure in public, hide behind titles and ceremony, but she would never erase the memory of that day, nor the searing truth that Diana's ghost had triumphed over her once more. Aftermath. Silence. In the palace. The palace awoke the next morning cloaked in an uneasy quiet, as though the very walls remembered what had transpired the day before. Servants went about their routines with more precision than usual, careful not to break the fragile stillness that had settled over the household. The clinking of china at breakfast sounded sharper, footsteps in the corridors echoed longer, and every whispered exchange carried the weight of something that could not be spoken aloud. The confrontation between William and Camilla had ended the previous afternoon, but its shadow lingered over every hallway and chamber, like a storm cloud refusing to pass. Those who had witnessed the clash firsthand carried themselves with rigid composure, yet their eyes betrayed them. A butler polishing silver moved with mechanical care, his mind replaying William's voice as if it still reverberated through the room. A maid arranging fresh flowers in the hall could not help but remember Camilla's face as she turned to leave, her pride fractured under the force of William's command. No one dared to mention it openly, but the memory clung stubbornly to each of them, refusing to fade. Even those who had not been present could feel the tension. Rumors had already spread through the staff quarters, passed quietly from one servant to another. By the time night had fallen, every wing of the palace seemed to hum with variations of the same tale. Camilla had insulted Diana, and William had forced her out. No one knew precisely what words had been exchanged, yet everyone understood the heart of it. The late Princess of Wales had been defended with a ferocity that reminded the household she was not gone, not truly, and her presence still shaped the destiny of the monarchy. William himself was seldom seen that day. When he appeared, his steps were steady, his expression calm, but those who crossed his path sensed the heaviness behind his composure. He offered no explanation, no acknowledgement of what had happened, but the silence spoke louder than words. It was the silence of a man who knew he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. For the staff, it was enough to keep their tongues guarded, to carry their duties with absolute precision, for fear that a single misstep might fracture the brittle calm that now hung in the air. Camilla's absence was equally telling. She remained behind closed doors, her movements minimal, her interactions limited. The staff who served her did so with an almost painful politeness, careful not to reveal what they knew. Yet beneath their courtesy lay an unmistakable shift. The woman who had worked tirelessly to secure respect now carried the invisible mark of her humiliation, and no amount of protocol could erase it. The palace itself seemed to breathe differently in the aftermath. The chatter of daily life was subdued, the rhythm of routine muted. It was as though everyone understood that a line had been crossed and that even in silence, nothing would ever return to what it had been before. Diana's ghost lingered more powerfully than ever, And through William's fury and Camilla's retreat, the palace had been reminded that some names once spoken could never be dishonored without consequence. The ripple effect across the royal family. The silence that draped itself over the palace did not stay contained within its gilded walls. It spread outward like ripples across still water, touching every corner of the royal household until even those far removed from the confrontation felt its weight. Whispers traveled swiftly, carried from staff corridors to private chambers, from aides to advisors, until finally the matter reached the ears of those whose reactions could not be avoided. The clash between William and Camilla was no longer a private moment buried in the stillness of the palace. It had become a wound pulsing at the heart of the monarchy. Charles was the first to feel the full brunt of it. He had spent years balancing the fragile equilibrium between his wife and his sons, years smoothing over tensions that never fully healed. To hear that William had openly ordered Camilla out in front of staff was not only a humiliation for her, but a public fracture for him. Charles knew well that the servants' halls were rarely silent. Stories born in whispers had a way of growing wings, and before long, the world beyond the gates would sense the rift. His fury was tempered not by anger at William but by dread. He understood better than anyone how Diana's memory continued to shape his sons, and in that moment, he realized just how powerless he remained in the face of her enduring influence. Within the family, reactions were divided. Some saw William's defense of his mother as inevitable, a confrontation that had been brewing for years. Others worried about the implications. If the future king could so publicly undermine Camilla, what did that mean for the unity of the monarchy? The royal family had always depended on the illusion of solidarity, on the performance of strength even when cracks ran deep. Now that illusion had been shattered within their own walls, with witnesses who could not easily forget what they had seen. For William, there was no regret in his actions, though he knew the consequences would be far-reaching. He had drawn a line, not out of spite, but out of love, and in doing so, he had reminded everyone that his mother's name would remain untouchable. Yet he also understood that his choice had altered his relationship with his father. Charles's loyalty was now split between the woman he had married and the son who would inherit the crown. That division was a wound time might never heal. Camilla herself bore the humiliation quietly, but those closest to her could sense the anger simmering beneath her composure. She had been forced out once before by public opinion, reduced to shadows until the years softened her image. To be forced out again, this time by Diana's son, cut deeper than any tabloid headline. It was not just an insult. It was a reminder that she would never escape the comparison, never fully win the acceptance she so desperately craved. Beyond the palace walls, the staff carried the story in their eyes and in their silence. They would not speak it openly, not yet, but the weight of what they knew was enough to suggest that when the truth eventually surfaced, it would shake the monarchy to its core. The confrontation had been private, but its ripples spread outward with each passing day, threatening to unravel the fragile balance upon which the royal family rested. And so, within the hidden corridors of the monarchy, a single confrontation revealed just how fragile the balance of power truly is. William's defense of his mother was more than a son's fury. It was a declaration that Diana's legacy remains unshakable, untouchable, and eternal. For Camilla, the humiliation was a reminder that acceptance can never erase the shadows of the past. And for the palace, the silence that followed spoke louder than words. As whispers grow and questions linger, one truth stands clear. The ghost of Diana still reigns, and through her son, her voice continues to shape the crown. What do you think about this story? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. Thank you for watching.